She cannot see in your mind, but perhaps you can see into hers. I will set her free. They tried to bury their sins, but instead planted the seeds of their doom.
If there's anything in life that's absolute, it's that the late 90s and early to mid 2000s was the absolute peak era for first-person shooters. Not only were these some of the best games we got for the genre, but the sheer variety in writing and premise alone still exceeds anything we've had recently. I mean, consider that in the year 2000 alone, we had Deus Ex and No One Lives Forever, two games which came out months apart but couldn't be more different if they tried. One's a cyberpunk-themed immersive sim focusing around conspiracies and a man-made plague, where you played as an augmented operative who wore sunglasses at night.
My vision is augmented.
The other was set in the 1960s as a tongue-in-cheek parody of old spy movies, where you played as a female Scottish secret agent stopping a dastardly evil organisation from unleashing a biological weapon. And then consider that only 5 years after that, those same devs made what's easily one of the best shooters of all time, with their 2005 masterpiece, F.E.A.R. And again, it's like you've gone from this bright and comical spy spoof set in the 1960s, where you're globe-trotting from one colourful environment to the next, interacting with characters that are outright caricatures, now to a dark and gritty shooter set in all these industrial and corporate environments at nighttime, with a story revolving around a murderous, psychic little girl who was abused, exploited, and now feeds off that pain and trauma to inflict grievous misery on everyone around her. Not to mention letting you play as a dude with reflexes so blindingly fast they'd make Max Payne envious. And seeing as it's coming up on this thing being 20 years old, and seeing as it feels like it's an eternity since I last got to talk about it, I thought it'd be fun going back one more time and checking if this thing still stands up. So, let's find out, shall we?
What about you, buddy? Ready to go to work?
I'd be right happy to.
Right, so the story is you're playing as the Point Man, working for the eponymous Special Forces squad named F.E.A.R, which is an acronym for Fresh Eggs and Rhubarbs. And these guys are a super tough elite group in charge of dealing with paranormal threats. Basically, they're like the X-Files division for stuff that SWAT teams or regular Special Forces can't handle. And they've got an absolute doozy this time here as well, with a so-called psychic commander named Paxton Fettel who's gone crazy and taken control of a whole battalion of clone super soldiers called replicants. Digging a bit further, we find out that Fettel's created by this powerful corporation called Armacam, which then all has connections to a mysterious Project Origin, and more than that, this creepy little girl named Alma, who's become so iconic and tied to this series that even if you haven't played the games, like, chances are you know who she is. She makes a few appearances early on, but then very quickly becomes this recurring antagonist that the player encounters throughout the story, with it eventually making a whole lot of sense as to why she keeps appearing, and then also why she doesn't keep turning the player inside out. Plus, on top of that, Alma's also directly connected to Armacam's president, Harlan Wade.
That's awfully convenient.
The Point Man also works alongside his buddy, Jankowski, who very quickly goes missing, and then a woman named Jin, who's like a medic, I guess, conducting forensic analysis to also try to ascertain what's going on.
I'm not even sure where to start.
Along with finally their commanding officer Betters, who we see for about 30 seconds during the intro, and then he spends the rest of the game just barking orders in your ear. And then about the only other person you interact with is a Delta Force bomb expert named Holiday.
That's right. Don't worry, you'll be fine.
The thing is though, outside of a few key moments, all of these characters really do take a bit of a backseat, with even the Point Man himself being completely devoid of any personality, which is outright by design.
You can't send him in alone, that's crazy.
Just comes at the cusp of that old school FPS era when we're really starting to get to the point where protagonists in video games would never shut up. And this is really the kind of game that you just never see made anymore, especially not by big development teams. I mean, could you imagine a AAA game to come out these days where the protagonist doesn't talk incessantly? I think if this game came out in 2025, you'd have the Point Man muttering to himself every few minutes on where he had to go next. But instead, what this game does is show you some brief cutscenes very early on, which are out of your control, but from pretty much that point on, you're seeing almost everything through your character's perspective. just that great first-person storytelling device that games like Half-Life helped to popularize and pioneer, and yeah, it's put to great effect here. Like, there's a sequence where Holiday's got to remove a bomb from some poor arsehole who's been taken hostage, and you'll escort this guy to the hostage in real time and watch this whole thing unfold.
Is that supposed to make me feel better?
You may be a pro, but I'm a master.
Also kind of means that you really only get out of the story what you put into it, which is why you'll see so many people saying that they think the story isn't handled very well, which honestly just leads me to believe that they're powering through the campaign without really taking the time in to absorb all these little details. Because if you do, you start to uncover a really nasty and sinister backstory. I mean, you got elements of psychological horror, but then there's also scientific and medical malpractice, along with corruption, murder, and child abuse. And it skates that line pretty well, man, coming across as being quite serious and dark, but then without also feeling needlessly edgy just for the sake of it. Yeah, something which those sequels absolutely fumbled, by the way. Then on top of all of this, you've got some of the most chaotic and enjoyable combat perhaps in any first-person shooter. Heavily inspired by John Woo films, and I'm sure in some cases by what Remedy Entertainment did years prior with Max Payne. It's no secret at this point how effortlessly this thing nails the slow-motion gun-fu component, and even to this day, like, very few games manage to make it feel this good. What I think makes F.E.A.R's combat so much fun, though, is how for the majority of fights, you're almost always given the advantage, in that you're the one that's given the option to choose how to initiate combat. Something which very few games actually do if you stop to think about it. I mean, look, as much as I love a lot of those older Call of Duty titles, for instance, there was a very familiar and tedious pattern there in how you'd always run into some big opened up area, and then enemies would also expectedly pour in at the same time and instantly engage the player. In F.E.A.R, though, you'd often walk into a room and you'd see the replicants patrolling or holding their position, completely oblivious to your presence. And you really felt like you had way more control choosing how the combat panned out. I mean, did you rush right in with the shotgun and catch everyone off guard, or maybe hang back and throw out a grenade to thin out the numbers early on? Oh yeah, truly too, one of the sickest things to do in this game is to just throw a grenade into a small group of enemies and just obliterate them. In fact, you know what? If you're not actively doing this, well, then you're playing the game wrong, bitch. And in fact too, like, they utilized this whole the player attacks first concept to such a degree that as a result, the couple of times you actually do get ambushed by the enemy, it ends up genuinely catching you off guard. I still remember playing through this when it first came out and how I just keep reloading checkpoints over and over. Playing through the same couple of rooms with a different weapon or taking a different approach just to see how the enemies would react. And this was before the days of things like Shadowplay or OBS when they were commonplace. In fact, I think back then all we really had was Bandicam or Fraps. The latter which used to record these fucking humongous AVI files that took up gigabytes of storage space. What I've always thought was really awesome too was how a lot of the areas really felt like 1v1 deathmatch maps, which also meant that the pacing of each encounter was a lot faster, and combat could often be over as fast as it started, which would then also work in tandem with that whole power fantasy element, making you feel like this superhuman soldier zipping around with inhuman speed and reflexes, mowing a whole squad down before finishing off the last one with a perfectly placed karate kick or a slide. Kind of thing that's so satisfying it could be used as a marital aid. Praise also has to go into the rate at which they ramp up the combat too, which is pretty much seamless. I mean, for the very first proper encounter, you're really going up against only two soldiers. You got a guy here with his back to you, and then this other bloke standing next to a conveniently placed explosive barrel. But then within about 10 minutes, things have progressed to the point that you're taking on an entire squad of like 4 or 5 soldiers at once, and it really never loses speed from there on in. You start to see all these environmental elements like the explosive barrels, electrical boxes, and fire hydrants, and you always know how to put them to use. And yeah, man, we've got to talk about those fire hydrants because it seems in the F.E.A.R universe, these things explode with so much force that they can pretty much more or less jib someone completely. And it is pretty impressive how by the end of the game, targeting all these kind of elements becomes second nature. What's also kind of interesting is how F.E.A.R really does have a lot of elements from older FPS games, but then it also mixes in the more tactical elements from modern shooters. Like for instance, how you can more or less ADS to improve your accuracy, along with leaning around corners to minimize your exposure. The first proper level in the game has you rappelling out of a chopper in real time, which is just fucking awesome, and something we also didn't really get in FPS games back then either. Plus, it's also got a 3-weapon limit, so you can't haul around an entire arsenal at once, really emphasizing player choice and necessitating the need to constantly adapt. A lot of people crap on about the AI in this game being the bestest thing ever, and yeah, like it is definitely impressive and challenging, in the sense that they can shoot you if you're in their line of sight. But the way that it really impresses me is more in the amount of ways that it lets these guys interact with the environment too, which is the reason why you can replay an area 20 times and it's going to probably be different every single instance. Like for instance, these guys will hang back and take cover or even make some of their own, but then other times they might push forward, throwing grenades and jumping over obstacles. When their numbers are thinned out, you'll hear their combat chatter reflect that. And when they're heavily injured, you'll even see them limping away. Which is again the kind of thing that's still not commonplace in shooters, like even to this day, despite how far technology has advanced. What also plays a massive part in how cool all of this stuff is the soundtrack, composed by Nathan Grigg. Yeah, the same guy who worked on No One Lives Forever 2, and if you want to see a perfect example of how vastly different both of these titles are, then go listen to the music in that thing, and then compare it to F.E.A.R.
Don't make Harry angry!
I also kind of see this as an early example of the same kind of thing that Mick Gordon eventually did for the Doom series, where it's music that integrates more with the moment-to-moment gameplay, as opposed to dictating it directly, if that makes sense. So like during those areas where you're in between combat and navigating some creepy empty warehouse, it's going to be far more subtle and ambient. But then it can also quickly switch gears when you get back into being shot at by replicants, heightening that frantic element without feeling overbearing. One of the coolest examples of how it's utilized is a bit where your objective is to rescue Alice Wade. Now, she's the daughter of Armor Camp's President Harlan. And what you gotta do here is shoot your way through a small platoon of replicants to reach her office, where the music's at first a bit more restrained and a bit calmer, before you get to that final push to the room she's being held, where it just changes drastically, during those last few rooms where the enemy forces become overwhelming. And it takes what would have been a pretty routine shootout through a bunch of rooms and turns it into one of the most memorable sequences in the whole game. And then even a sequence shortly after this during a shootout in the garage is memorable for similar reasons. Even the music from the very first proper combat sequence in the game is easily one of the most recognizable pieces in the whole soundtrack. It's kind of what the kids these days refer to as a hype and aura moment. Did I use that correctly? Now, to balance out all of these awesome sequences where you feel like death incarnate are the moments when F.E.A.R. completely switches gears, and instead does its best to scare the absolute shit out of you. What it kind of feels like the devs understood as well is that the most terrifying stuff in horror is the stuff you barely get a good look at. You know what I mean? The kind of stuff you only briefly get to see before it buggers off. The kind of thing that lets your mind fill in the blanks, along with having you mutter to yourself, what the hell was I just looking at? And it does this pretty well during the prologue sequence with a few quick cutaways, along with the visuals of a dark figure off in the distance always walking out of frame. Then you've got these other, more intense moments when you have these full-on hallucinations or visions, seeing this recurring one inside some kind of hospital, which has bugger all indication as to what's even happening, as you're stuck inside this surreal nightmare that you can't escape. People always bring up that infamous ladder scene as one of the best moments in the game, and yeah, don't get me wrong, it's definitely up there. But I think one that's even better is this bit when you're moving through this small sewer area, and you suddenly see a bunch of rats running away from something ahead, along with eerie static in your radio, and then the brief sight of Ulmer walking past you in the dark. Your eyes are then drawn to one of these blue health upgrade stims off in the distance, and then as you grab this thing, you get that wonderful real-time lighting put into effect, seeing Ulmer's shadow move right behind you, only to turn as she disappears around the corner. Fuck. One of the other infamous moments is the first time you encounter one of those heavy soldiers who are walking tanks armed with a penetrator nail gun. And the first time you encounter one of these blokes, he bursts through a nearby door, with the point man's reflexes activating automatically as if it's his spidey senses. And in fact, I'd even argue that this thing scared more people than that latter scene did. And it's the stuff like this that still lingers in my brain 20 years later, along with the first date that I ever went on with my wife, and all the random throwaway dialogue from episodes of The Simpsons and Seinfeld. And even just the usage of real-time lighting and shadows in this game as a means to heighten the atmosphere is almost a bit of a relic in itself, considering we're at the point now where people don't even really care about that stuff anymore. F.E.A.R actually uses an updated version of Monolith's Jupiter engine, and it just comes from that prime era where video game engines had all these kind of awesome effects, like parallax mapping and hard stencil shadows, also making it the most 2005 looking game ever made. The thing that it really nails though is all of these various particle effects like the muzzle flash, the bullet impacts and decals. Not to mention the visual distortion and other effects when you activate slow motion. Like how turning on slow motion increases the sharpness of the overall image, which is really meant to highlight the razor sharp reflexes of the point man, where he's suddenly become hypersensitive to all of his surroundings. Another really awesome effect is how when something explodes, it literally warps the image to emphasize that kinetic force of the blast. And when you combine this in an area where there's lots of destructible and breakable elements like glass or other props, it just makes for absolute visual chaos.
Holy moly.
Plus, I also appreciate all of those other subtle effects as well, like this one-off room where the water refractions cascade across the walls, an effect which never comes back again for the remainder of the game. Even just the way you can shoot light sources and watch them fly around, casting dynamic shadows across every surface. And then probably what's my favourite, how you've got this random-ass room where someone's modelled in a working photocopier that just seems to scan back and forth endlessly. And it was just so cool seeing all of this stuff for the first time back in 2005, because we genuinely didn't really see visuals like this in video games. And it just felt like every little trick or gimmick they'd pull off within the engine felt unique and new, because it was. Even in just the way that they somehow managed to make all of these weapons feel unique and interesting is worth mentioning as well. And when I think of F.E.A.R's weapons, the two that always instantly come to mind for me are the submachine gun and the shotgun.
Of course.
Now, I think this game's version of the SMG is one of the all-time best we've ever had in the genre, because there's just something about the way this thing sounds and handles that always makes it fun to use, to the point that I often find myself spraying a few extra bullets on purpose. And if you're playing the version for the Xbox 360, you even get these unique dual submachine guns, which are surprisingly effective. Even still though, using the one on the PC, when you spray wildly with this thing and light up an entire area, there's few things in gaming which are so cathartic. The other weapon, which of course is a no-brainer to anyone who's ever played F.E.A.R or even seen it in action, is that goddamn shotgun. Yeah dog, hands down one of the best shotguns in all the gaming. Plus one that also perfectly encapsulates everything the combat is about. For starters, it outright forces you to get in nice and close to the enemies to make it the most effective, which then also helps to keep the pace of the combat flowing and prevent it from feeling lethargic. I mean, you can hang back with this thing or one of the other long-range weapons if you really want to, but it's so much more fun if you rush on in and just get into everyone's face. And then off the back of that, it's also really handy because it can kill most enemies in a single hit, really making you feel like this unstoppable force of nature, also letting you appreciate these ridiculous ragdoll physics even more. And if you're playing this thing with a super high frame rate, those physics become even more absurd. Plus, it's also got one of the most over-the-top effects as well, where enemies can often be completely turned into mist. Yeah, literally going from a solid object to liquefied in a single hit. And again, to the best of my knowledge, there's no other game that's ever done this.
Lord have mercy.
I mean, I think you might have been able to do it in Trepang too, and I know Sulaco also had a really beefy shotgun, but yeah man, guess which game inspired both of those? The Penetrator Nail Gun is also a certified hood classic. Now, this is the same weapon used by those heavy replicants, and it not only does high damage, but has the awesome ability to nail enemies to nearby walls. And I almost forgot to talk about the pistols, which do surprisingly high damage, not to mention they're even effective later in the game against the tougher replicants. The assault rifle is alright as well, but it's really just a slower firing and harder hitting version of the submachine gun, and one which I feel just doesn't have that same oomph and impact as its lighter counterpart does. You got this scoped rifle thing that you come across, I think, like 4 or 5 times in the entire campaign, which is also good and does great damage, but this thing's really only effective from long range. And like I said before, like the combat is at its best when you're constantly moving, being aggressive and trying to push ahead. Whereas this thing just encourages you to really plant yourself in one spot. Plus, I'm also not too keen on how it fires in bursts, which is a weird trend that pretty much every automatic weapon in the game seems to have. Even the rocket launcher you get later on does the exact same thing. Then you got the last couple of weapons, which on the other hand are just completely broken. Now, one of these is the particle weapon, which is more or less like a scoped railgun that has the very handy benefit of being able to melt someone's skin off in a single shot. You're quite literally just melting all of their skin and muscle off and leaving behind a perfectly intact skeleton, which in and of itself is a bit of a scientific marvel. But it does also become kinda boring due to just how good it actually is, removing any real sense of challenge in the later game areas. And then the final one is like a heavy cannon that you really only get in the last half hour or so, and you'll understand why as soon as you use it, because again, it just demolishes pretty much everything in a single hit. To be honest though, all of this stuff is pretty on brand for Monolith, and from at least as far back as Shogo Mobile Armor Division, these guys just love to put stupidly overpowered weapons into their games. Consider in Shogo alone, you've got that bull gut thing that launches out like a dozen missiles, which again, just destroys everything in front of you.
I think you need to get over this obsession, it's not healthy.
Along with a weapon like the Shredder, which was essentially a semi-automatic rocket launcher. Yeah, damn. So to have a weapon here that can remove someone's entire muscle tissue in a single hit is pretty much right on brand.
It's like a reward.
Oh yeah, and I almost didn't talk about the best weapon in the entire game, and that's the standard frag grenade, which when you master lets you destroy entire groups at once with ease. Oh yeah, and as far as I know too, this is one of the few games ever made where you can shoot a grenade in midair. There is also proximity and a remote grenade as well, and there is definitely something fun about setting up traps with the enemies for these, but that basic frag grenade is absolutely doing all of the heavy lifting.
Let's see that in an instant replay.
Holy shit!
Now, as far as the campaign goes, F.E.A.R was pretty standard for the time, coming in at about 8 to 10 hours for a first playthrough, which then gets shorter and shorter the more familiar you are with the game. But the fact of the matter is that overall, the campaign honestly is kinda basic, even by, and in fact especially by 2005 standards. Like compared to something like Half-Life 2 for instance, which came out a year before it, where you've got an almost seamless journey across a small chunk of Eastern Europe. You're moving around sewers and canals, you got a whole chapter set on the airboat, and then another one in the buggy on Highway 17. Followed by controlling giant bugs with a squishy alien testicle. I mean, damn dog, even Half-Life 1 was more complex if you think about it. Even with stuff like On a Rail having an entire section of the Black Mesa lab be explorable on a motorized cart. Followed by that massive shift up near the end when you got to Zen. F.E.A.R's campaign, on the other hand, is all about just shooting guys in warehouses or other industrial areas. Followed by shooting guys in an office, then shooting guys in more warehouses, and then shooting guys in an underground lab. That's about it. Where the most variety you're gonna see is the few times you get to control these ceiling-mounted machine gun turrets. Though, I do have to wonder why a corporate office building needs machine gun turrets built into the ceiling. So yeah, like on the one hand, I do understand a lot of the criticisms where people complained here, how the variety in the gameplay they thought was lacking, because in fairness, it kind of is. And you can see that they were very clearly working on creating some different sequences. Like, if you go and watch that old E3 trailer from like 2004, you can clearly see there's a bit there where Jankowski's manning the turret on a chopper, along with a sequence later on there involving some kind of car chase. But for whatever reason, I guess they decided to cut it. The thing is though, none of that really matters because the core aspect of the game, being the shooting, is just so fucking good to begin with. And in fairness, they do try to mix things up a little bit so you're not just always fighting the same looking replicant over and over. So there's a few times in there, for instance, when you take on these cloaked assassin things, which like to hide on walls or around corners, and then bum rush the play when they're detected. Plus, there's also these armored power suits you get to take on a few times as well. Kind of like a miniaturized mech suit that's got rocket launchers for arms, and these things can take a serious beating. And in fact as well, the couple of times you encounter them, they're introduced in a way which is an outright jump scare. But then of course you've also got those more piss-weak enemy types, like those ceiling-mounted gun turrets, yeah, same ones the player gets to control, which don't even really require any serious strategy to beat, like you just literally shoot at them until they explode, trying to not lose too much health in the process. Along with these flying drones, which again aren't super clever or interesting. Thankfully though, you only have to deal with both of these I think like 2 or 3 times in the entire campaign. In reality though, most of the combat is going to be against the replicants, or enemies that more or less function exactly the same. Like the armor cam security forces, who even have similar combat chatter to let you know what they're up to. I mean, I think they might have slightly different AI behavior and less health than the replicants, but they still carry the same weapons and act identical during combat. About the only difference we get is that in the last few eras, there's these tougher variants of the replicants who have got more hit points and armor, which lets them soak up more damage. Along with these weird ghost apparition things that start appearing out of literally nowhere, looking like they're coming out of black holes or something to attack the Point Man. But in the game's defense, by that point in the story, it's more about the narrative aspect anyway, after they've fully explained who Alma is and the Point Man's connection to everything. Which also makes you realise why he's been seeing all these weird visions throughout the campaign, and also why Alma's treated him differently to everyone else. And I still find the image of that final explosion sequence to just be absolutely epic, with the feeling of the Point Man engulfed and knocked back by the shockwave still being really impressive.
This is great!
Also ending on one of the most sphincter-clenching cliffhangers of all time, which, if I'm being honest, I would have been perfectly happy with them leaving as it is, you know, without ever needing to make a bunch of sequels or expansions.
What was that sound?
Yeah, but of course, as we all know, that didn't happen, because once something is successful, there's that tendency from corporations to milk it as much as possible, until all those creative juices are well and truly squeezed dry.
Oh sure, I'm having a hell of a time.
Which is why we ended up with the lackluster F.E.A.R 2, and then the very lackluster, bordering on terrible F.E.A.R 3. Honestly though, I didn't hate F.E.A.R 2, and in fact I kinda like how it tried to mix things up a bit, by having the player beginning the story without that reflex ability, to really emphasize how much of a godsend that power was. Even if it does kind of trivialize it a little bit there, taking it from being this ability that's ingrained into someone from birth to a commodity that anyone can have under the right circumstances.
You'll feel a little pinch.
Still though, the story I thought was mostly good, and it had some pretty awesome sequences inside power suits and on gun turrets, along with some really nice crafted horror moments that were far more impressive and scary than anything in that first game. Not to mention one of the most batshit insane endings.
Never ever.
F.E.A.R 3, on the other hand, well, yeah, that thing was complete arse. I mean, for starters, it's not even developed by Monolith. Instead, it's Day One Studios. And instead of trying to introduce new characters or plot points, it just brings back the Point Man and Paxton Fettel, with them now both working together to try to stop Alma. Even showing the Point Man's face this time, making him this super edgy dude that just never talks and spends the entire game grimacing. This also came out in that peak edgy era of mid to late 2000s gaming, making it feel so over the top and try hard, and story-wise, none of it even really needed to be told in the first place. I mean, I do kind of think the co-op aspect is interesting with this whole sibling rivalry thing they got going on, but then again, playing this with another person completely removes the horror component, and it feels absolutely nothing like the other games, with the bullet time stuff amazingly being even worse. The cinematics and the writing were also worked on by John Carpenter, which, yeah, would have been awesome if this thing came out back in the 1980s. Only this was the 2000s, after he'd done such classics as The Ward and Ghosts of Mars.
Come on, you mindless motherfuckers!
But look, like, we're kind of jumping ahead a bit here, considering I haven't even talked about the expansion packs. Because, as was the style at the time, shortly after an FPS game came out, you could bet your bottom dollar that an expansion pack developed by a completely different team wasn't too far behind. First one for F.E.A.R being Extraction Point that came out in 2006, developed by Timegate Studios. And this one is at least pretty interesting in how it kicks things right off after the ending of the base game. Quite literally, right after it. Showing that sequence again as the Point Man, Jin, and Holiday are heading away from the city before Alma pops up and causes their chopper to crash.
What was that sound?
Then you wake up shortly after that in the ruins of a building and have to make your way to another extraction point on the other side of the city. Yep, hence the name. With all the replicants now being inactive after Fettel's death, at first anyway, because it seems his presence still lingers, which kicks these things back on.
I didn't like that.
And with Alma still being very active as well, doing her usual routine of making weird stuff happen to the Point Man to keep the player on edge. And at first, I do think things are pretty awesome. Got some really cool opening spooky sections as you're moving through this church and then the crypts underneath it. Plus, I think the shootout that follows inside this funeral home, or whatever it's supposed to be, features some of the best combat in the entire series. Simply because all of the rooms are constructed in a way where your eye line is very short, which works great with a weapon like the shotgun. Again, allowing you to bum rush into rooms and run right up to people before they can even react. Followed by it having one of the biggest scares I've ever had in the series. During this bit after all the combat, when you're finally done shooting things, and you enter a nearby room only to see Fettel looking in through the window. And I still remember playing this late at night back in the day and having a fucking heart attack.
Okay, so I just shitted my pants on God. I'll be right back. I'm gonna play a YouTube video and I'm gonna go change my underwear.
And truthfully too, it is worth praising the horror aspect of this expansion, which I think is way more intense in some ways and frightening than some of the stuff we got in the base game. The problem is that soon after these opening sections is where it all just kind of goes to shit. And it's like they really didn't know how to make any of this go in an interesting directions. A lot of the combat areas are also much bigger and more opened up, meaning you kind of have to sit back and take pot shots at the replicants from a further distance. Which just makes F.E.A.R feel like any other generic shooter from the time and really strips away all of its identity. It's not helping either that the game is so dark, with it being really tricky to spot enemies. And I found that while the base game did a good job of balancing dark environments with visibility, here though that's not quite the case. A lot of the so-called new enemies are also just really reskins of the other ones as well. Like these new ghost things you come up against are clearly just the assassins. You take on a few more of these powered armor suits as well, and the expansion's addition to this is just a bigger armor suit that has more hit points. Then you're going up against these newer, tougher versions of the replicants, but as far as I can tell, the only difference is that they've got more health points. Even able to now withstand a direct grenade to the face, which is just dumb. And look, like I don't mind tougher enemies in my video games, but if literally all that's making them tougher is that they've got more hit points, whilst not really the kind of challenge that feels genuine. The only real genuinely new enemy here is another variant armed with a shield and a minigun, but even these guys kind of prove my point, because the main method to beating them is just to shoot them in the face a whole lot more than you would the others. Off the back of that though, the good thing is that you can actually pick up those miniguns, making it one of the few new weapons the expansion adds in, and also one of the most disgusting in a good way. I mean, going full auto with one of these things in slow motion is just objectively awesome, and it's pure chaos to the point that I'm amazed the Australian government hasn't banned it.
That's a bloody outrage, it is!
The other weapon you get is what's more or less like a laser gun, which kind of ties into F.E.A.R's whole realistic / science fiction vibe it's got. And this thing fires out a constant stream of energy, which seems to have near infinite range. Not to mention it can also stun lock enemies, making it very useful. And then finally you also get a new grenade type, kind of, with these little turret things you can throw out that then latch onto walls and shoot at enemies. Even then though, they're only really useful in a couple of scenarios, both of which when you're inundated with them. Ultimately though, I've just never found this expansion all that good, and I'm frequently surprised when I see people giving it high praise. And one of the reasons I dislike it is in how it deals with Holiday and Jin, with both of them suffering some pretty horrific fates and getting a nasty death. Holiday's thrown around the room violently by this unseen force, and while we only hear Jin screaming off screen as opposed to seeing it, the state she's in when we find her corpse really shows us that she didn't part this world in a nice way. And it's just the same kind of vibe I get from seeing Hicks and Newt killed off at the beginning of Alien 3. You know what I mean? Where you've got these two really strong characters who made it through literal hell, only to now be killed off in the most unceremonious ways.
What was that sound?
Luckily though, none of this stuff is canon, so technically they're still alive. Somewhere.
It's false. No way. Not this time. We created it. Not this time. Pure fiction.
But what is interesting is despite this being non-canon, they really did copy a lot of this stuff over into F.E.A.R 2.
Are you fucking kidding me?
I mean, for starters, F.E.A.R 2 also takes place in the city after the blast that goes off at the ending of the first game, with the player then having to explore the ruins as they try to escape. There's even a whole series of levels set inside the subway tunnels, which again was a prominent location in F.E.A.R 2. And then even the laser carbine here is identical to the one in that game. There's also times where Ulma assists the Point Man, similar to how she'd help out Beckett. Though obviously it doesn't quite end in the same way, with the guy getting violently molested at the end of the story. In fact, pretty much nothing happens at the end of the story. Yeah, there's no kind of boss fight or anything. Instead, you just got a bit of a sequence where you've got to hold out on the rooftop of a hospital, waiting for the chopper to arrive and pick you up. And this is just the player getting attacked by wave after wave of enemies, only for the chopper to just blow up anyway as the Point Man passes out. With the final thing you see being this nightmarish vision of this crumbling and burning city. And also the last we see of this guy until F.E.A.R 3. So this means that in Extraction Point, you pretty much accomplished bugger all. I mean, all you really did was run across an entire city for nothing and get your buddies killed in the process. Yeah, nice one, dumbass.
Are you fucking kidding me?
After all of this, we got Perseus Mandate, which honestly I think is even worse. And again, what is at least unique about this one is how it takes place during the events of that base game, as you're seeing things through the eyes of another member of the F.E.A.R team, someone who also has similar reflexes to the Point Man.
That may just be the tip of the iceberg.
Which I guess means that everyone on that squad has the same kind of superpower, as if Oprah was handing them out one day, like, you get super reflexes and you get super reflexes. Either way, you're instead part of a separate team investigating Project Perseus, which is the experiment responsible... Either way, you're instead part of a separate team investigating Project Perseus, which is the experiment responsible for creating Ulma in the first place, along with, in turn, both the Point Man and F.E.A.R. Yeah, sorry, spoilers. Your other two squad mates are a guy named Chen and then Captain Rains, voiced by the instantly recognizable Steve Bloom.
We proceed with extreme caution. We still don't know what we're dealing with.
With you and your boys now taking on a whole new mercenary group called the Nightcrawlers, not to be confused with the X-Men character of the same name. And the Nightcrawlers are essentially the cleanup team sent in by Armor Cam to destroy all the evidence and make sure the truth doesn't get out. Yes, kind of like the Black Ops guys you went up against in Half-Life Opposing Force, where you already had a Special Forces unit to begin with the HECU, but now these guys are the special unit. Though a lot like Opposing Force, it is at least cool seeing similar crossover events, like the point when that blast destroys half the city, followed by that initial outbreak of paranormal events that start to occur. You even get a one-off vision of seeing poor Jankowski's brutalized body, which scared the piss out of me.
Interesting.
Otherwise, though, it is all pretty forgettable stuff, and what few new characters are introduced, we see very little of, with almost all of them ending up dying in horrific ways. One guy in particular outright getting pancaked by a truck. Okay, I'll admit that was actually pretty awesome. Gameplay-wise, Perseus Mandate doesn't add anything all that new either. It's really just more of the same in terms of it being mostly linear and having you move from one room to the next. There's a few new guns around this time too, like with the grenade launcher, which seems cool at first until you realise that the impact range for this thing is about the size of a bee's dick. There's also the arc cannon, which is more or less like a railgun that chains lightning between enemies, which is one of the better weapons, but they barely ever let you use this thing. And it seems every time you're about to go ballistic with it, you either run out of ammo or people to kill. And then the final new weapon they've added in is an assault rifle with an infrared scope, which you almost have to use. Firstly, because it's by far the most common weapon, so you're always going to have ammo, but then also because the environments in this expansion are really dark, to the point that yet again, it's often really hard to just simply see enemies off in the distance. And yes, like I know that the other games have been dark as well, but there's a difference between something being dark for mood and atmosphere, and then something just being dark because they forgot to put enough light sources in. As for everything else, well, that's just basically stuff they've reused from Extraction Point. Like the laser carbine, the minigun, and those throwable gun turrets. The latter of which are yet again only really useful in a couple of instances. A lot of the enemies are just flat out recycled as well, like those tougher armored variants of the replicants in the ATC forces. And in fact, even this new faction, the Nightcrawlers, are just a reskin replicant at the end of the day. There's those super annoying ghost things that come back as well in a few sequences, which go on for way longer than they need to. Which means that the only real new enemy type is like an elite version of the Nightcrawlers that seem to have similar abilities to the player, in the sense that they can zip all over the place and dodge some of your attacks. Which does sound cool at first until you realise that it's not adding anything all that new to the formula. Basically, yet again, it's just like they've got more hit points than anyone else, but the same tactics that apply to the other enemies apply to them. In fact, the final boss fight, if I can even call it that, is against the leader, and he's just like an elite version of these elites, having even more health points.
Why won't you die?
I don't think it's all terrible though, and there was a quite cool sequence in there where you're getting hunted by one of those giant mech things, which even drops through the floor and can smash down the walls. But even this is just another enemy brought back from Extraction Point. And the concept of a mech suit chasing you through a building was done in the base game anyway. On another positive note, I guess the horror stuff is still pretty good, and there is a lot of moments in here that are genuinely unsettling and creepy. Along with this bit here, which just made me want to puke. But overall, it really just feels like they ran out of ideas by this point. I mean, the underground levels, for instance, are the exact same ones from the opening of Extraction Point, and that they even reused that subway station later on. I've always kind of thought that the sweet spot for FPS expansions was really just to make one. And I mean, if you look at all the expansion packs for other shooters from back then, the first one was usually the most solid. Like Opposing Force, for instance, with Half-Life, or Resurrection of Evil for Doom 3. And it just kind of seems like the more they tried to squeeze content out of a game for an expansion, the less and less interesting the whole thing got. Perseus Mandate is a perfect example of that, and it's really squeezing this thing dry, where by this point the only thing really carrying it is the engine. I did a video a few years back on all the first-person shooters made by CI Games, and some of those titles that those guys worked on were using F.E.A.R's engine, which made them feel instantly familiar. They weren't amazing games at any stretch, and they were very clearly just blatant bargain bin bait, but those same basic shooting controls and mechanics alone were just enough to make them slightly acceptable. Because under all of it, you could see the essence of what could have been and feel the DNA from a much superior game. That's how I feel about Perseus Mandate, man. It's not exciting, clever, or revolutionary, but I can still feel F.E.A.R underneath it, tucked away like a repressed memory, where when I play it, it's just enough to let me put up with all the other shortcomings. Mostly. And again, if nothing else, it does at least have a semi-good ending in that you actually manage to escape. Yeah, dog, your chopper gets away scot-free. Armor doesn't pop up again as the credits roll, and you don't end up catching a stray missile and getting blown the hell up. Which, as far as the series goes, is pretty damn good, considering extraction choppers in these games seem to be explosion magnets. But you know what? Again, none of this really matters because like Extraction Point, this thing isn't considered canon and is really just glorified fanfiction.
It's fiction. It's fiction. We made it up.
None of this really detracts from that base game, however, and I think in actuality it makes you appreciate that first entry even more. Because you realise just how on top of their game Monolith were back in the day, where they managed to create this tightly crafted experience where you went from one operatic combat encounter to the next. Its legacy and influence lives on mostly in the indie scene, but even still, few have managed to come close to topping what these guys did decades ago. It's also one of the few games I find myself replaying from start to finish every few months, almost like an addict breaking his streak and falling off the wagon. And I think that's a perfect analogy, considering the feeling you get from this thing is often like video game crack. So yeah, on the off chance that you're one of the few people who still hasn't played this thing, all I can ask is, what are you waiting for?